Good evening, everyone. Good evening here in the room and good evening outside at the screens. Welcome to the Berlin Center for Intellectual Diaspora. We have our, I think, the fourth evening already of this conference, and it's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce you to Judith Hahn and an evening with Judith Hahn and Teresa Forcades. The day's subject today was ramifications of the concept of authority. And just come in. These things happen when you have a real life conference and evening panel and not only one on screens. Very welcome to you too. What I'm especially thrilled about is that this is already the second all-female panel that I have to chair at this conference. It is a great honor, and in preparation of it, I wondered, what is it about female authority? It is my question, staying within the metaphor of a tree ramification. One could still envision a tree whose branches are fully developed on the male side, whereas it has only little buds on the female side. There are sometimes, it is clear that women in the Western world enter the public sphere more and more, but it is also clear that we have in this conference, half of the participants and the speakers are female, as you might have noticed, which is not by chance, but because we think it should be. And yes, still, what is the female authority whom we refer to? It's Hannah Arendt. It's Hannah Arendt, and then it is again Hannah Arendt, deservedly towering in the landscape, but have others perhaps deserved to be ascribed similar authority? And how about routinization of authority of this kind? I'm sure others will follow Arendt, but somehow there are still very few schools. Perhaps we shouldn't even look that way any longer, not asked, just do. This is exactly what we are trying to do here, and I am glad to say it begins to work. And maybe the idea of philosophical and theological schools, practical as it may seem, will change. Or do we really want more school troubles like the Butlerians against the Nussbaumians in the beginning of this century? Maybe not. We have been brilliantly informed by some contributions here. There is no formally muted group that will be able to found new institutions pure of sins. There is no language which will be equally pure or just towards all possible speakers. Probably the eternal human problem that we solve one problem and find ourselves with two new ones will prevail for everybody. Yet, not only do we all share the desire for improvement on several levels, small improvements with some, an entire new worldview with others, it is also the permanent fear that our efforts to save the planet or just our own poor skin for a while might be in vain, that our beautiful buildings of stone or wood or symbols might collapse, especially those of us who have been living quite comfortable lives by now in houses that seem to be well-founded, like this one here, often look a little bit haunted by the idea that things may change. And I often think that the Jewish tradition, with its long diasporic history, does not look like a modest Kantian house, as we had it today in Christopher's talk, let alone like a Babylonian tower. It rather looks to the ever so superior Christian eye like the content of a big bag full of debris, collected by people who wandered over fields of debris, picking up this or that little piece, and over the centuries trained in ramified ways of checking those small pieces and finding ever new possibilities of connection between them. That's at least how I used to read rabbinic literature, if I read it. And when I read the title of our first paper tonight, The Modern Catholic Crisis of Authority, or Why Catholics Should Study Halacha, I began to expect some kind lesson in how to deal with fields of debris. what we really will hear, you'll know in a moment. Professor Dr. Judith Hahn, who just arrived from Bonn, will tell us. She's a theologian and canonist, habilitation, Dr. Theol, JCL, University of Münster, and she is currently serving as University Professor of Canon Law at the Faculty of Catholic Theology at the University of Bonn. She was a visiting scholar at Thomas More Law School, Australian Catholic University, at the Faculty of Theology and Religion, University of Oxford, and a fellow at the Käthe Hamburger Center for Advanced Studies, Law as Culture in Bonn. She has published on the theory and sociology of canon law and on the status of religious law and secular law, the liberal state, and modern society, including the books Church Law in Modernity, Cambridge University Press 2019, and Grundlegung der Kirchenrechtssoziologie, Springer 2019. And she already has new stuff in the pipeline. Forthcoming books are The Language of Canon Law with Oxford University Press and Foundations of a Sociology of Canon Law. And now I think, yeah, you have the challenge, you are challenged to break it down for us, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I do my very best from a Catholic point of view to say something about Halacha. Dear ladies and gentlemen, as I proposed in the short text advertising my contribution tonight, we can find the Catholic Church is experiencing a fundamental crisis. I guess I tell you nothing new then. A key aspect of which is the crisis of authority. This problem, as I suggest, is part of a development which has been unfolding since the 19th century. And the magisterium established the practice to issue doctrinal statements, mostly in the form of decisions. Over the past 2 centuries, it seems, Catholic teaching has become less an endeavor to discover the truth shared by the faithful, and more an endeavor to decide hierarchically of what the Catholic truth is. This theoretical approach to deciding epistemic issues in any case has come under increasing criticism. Many Catholics, particularly from the churches of the Northern Hemisphere, have become disinclined to accept the magisterium's decisions, thereby challenging the very essence of the magisterium's authority. I do not think that a remedy to this homegrown conflict is currently at hand. However, I consider studying rabbinic texts on authority and truth-finding as helpful to comprehending the roots of this conflict and to identifying alternative approaches to solving conflicts over difficult issues in challenging times. By exploring halakhic examples of how to discover God's will under critical circumstances, the Catholic debates may profit from the rabbi's dialectic approach to power and authority, which serve truth-finding and decision-making. My argument will follow 3 steps. First, I want to shortly reference the development which has led Catholicism on its path from finding the truth to deciding what the truth is. Second, I will substantiate my finding why this gives rise to a major crisis of authority in church. Third, I will propose to study 2 rabbinic narratives, the story of the oven of Akademie, as found in the Talmudic tractate Baba Mazia, and the narrative about a conflict between the rabbinic schools of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, as found in tractate Eruvin of the Babylonian Talmud. Studying these texts, as I want to suggest, helps to get a clearer grasp of the issues which are at stake in struggles over truth and authority. Both stories are probably very familiar to most Jewish listeners, so please forgive me for boring you a little. However, they are less known among Christian disputants, which is a pity, as I find, as they contain a wisdom on which other religions can draw. Over the past couple of decades, many Catholics have come to doubt many issues, many aspects of Catholic doctrine, ranging from issues on sex and gender to faith and reason, nature and culture. Whilst many Catholics believe that there is something which we might call divine law, which concords with the will of God for humanity, they have come to doubt of whether perceiving the will of God is as easy as the Catholic magisterium tends to suggest. Many of their doubts arise from their discovery of how Catholicism traditionally achieves its homogeneous doctrine. Its homogeneity is the result of the magisterium's molding the plural ideas of what Catholics regard as pleasing in God's eyes into a homogeneous body of norms. By relying on its hierarchical structuring, not only for its administrative organization, but also for the organization of its knowledge, the Church regards its magisterium as capable and assigned to defining what concords with God's will. Doctrine is formulated at the top of the hierarchical ecclesiastical pyramid and then handed down to the Church members, who are expected to accept it as according with God's will for God's Church. Hence, the improbable task of deciding which norms accord with God's will and are consequently binding on human beings is solved by the Church by pointing at those in charge of the Church's teaching office, primarily the Pope and the bishops in unity with him. Thus, the Church solves the epistemic problem connected with normative concepts, which we might call divine law, by alluding to authority. Behind God's will, as a validity reason of norms, stands power, as the power to decide and discern what accords with God's plan. Unlike Thomas Hobbes' presumption, it is not wisdom but authority that makes a law. The traditional Catholic perception is that it is wisdom to entrust the authority with making the law. The idea that it is wise for the magisterium to decide is part of a development which has been unfolding since the 19th century, when the official Church started to issue statements of a doctrinal nature in the form of decisions. This development found its semantic expression in many papal and curial documents, as systematic theologian Michael Seewald observes, which instead of speaking of doctrinal teaching, began to refer to doctrinal decisions. Seewald observes that the magisterium had traditionally presented doctrine as the discovering of God's true will, as those findings which the magisterium understands as corresponding with God's truth, to which church authorities have superior access due to the acting of the Spirit. However, since the mid-19th century, the magisterium has increasingly presented itself as a sovereign producer of doctrine. Doctrine slowly became less a matter of finding and discovering, and more a matter of defining and deciding. This is not unwise. Literate modernity, after all, put some end to the idea that ordination bestows higher wisdom upon those who have been ordained. Reacting to this development, the Church modified its validity theory in the 19th century by placing more emphasis on juridical power. Hence, different to Hobbes, we do not witness a shift from wisdom to power, but rather a shift from epistemic power to juridical power. Seewald believes this shift from epistemic to juridical power was motivated by the papacy's 19th century attempt to immunize the papacy and church hierarchy from being challenged and questioned. Epistemic authorities are never immune from being challenged and questioned. There's always reason to ask if their teaching should change. However, once decided authoritatively on the basis of juridical power, the authority may stop further debates. Hence, juridical power can serve as what Richard Rorty called conversation stopper. With respect to Catholic doctrine, it has officially, at least, served to stop debates on many issues, such as the role of women in church, extramarital sex, marriage, and contraception. Historian Michael Lacey observes, and I quote, "Humanae Vitae was intended as such a conversation stopper, so was Ordinatio Sacerdotalis," end of quote. Humanae Vitae is the 1968 papal encyclical on birth control, and Ordinatio Sacerdotalis is a 1994 decision on reserving priestly ordination to men alone. Yet while many decisions which the papacy took in the 19th and 20th centuries were intended to serve as conversation stoppers, they were not particularly successful in truly ending the debates. Even highly authoritative decisions such as Humanae Vitae and Ordinatio Sacerdotalis could not prevent discussions on sexual ethics, contraception, or women's ordination from continuing in church and in academic theology. The Catholics' resistance to end the debates, in any case, is more than a casual disagreement about particular doctrinal issues. It reveals, as I want to state, a fundamental crisis of authority, as Michael Lacey and Francis Oakley describe in their book, The Crisis of Authority in Catholic Modernity. This conflict is due to the fact that juridical power has increasingly failed to convince the faithful of the magisterium's superiority in discerning God's will. This disbelief might have grown slowly over the 20th century. However, there were also singular events which sent shockwaves of disbelief through the Catholic community. Humanae Vitae, as many theologians and church historians have analyzed, was such a major incident. After the Second Vatican Council had proposed fundamental reform, Humanae Vitae brought radical disenchantment. It proved that there was manifest dissent between the magisterium and many faithful, including clerics and laypeople. The doctrine went against many Catholics' impression that they knew better. This was perhaps the first time the papacy had exercised its power to decide an issue by authority, where most church members actually felt they knew more about the issue than the Pope. This led to fundamental doubts among the faithful, not only about the doctrine, but about magisterial authority itself, with vital consequences for their perception of authority in church. Systematic theologian Richard Gallardi places Humanae Vitae at the root of the crisis of doctrinal credibility and states, I quote, "This loss of credibility, which came to its head in the decades-long non-reception of Humanae Vitae, represents, I believe, the culmination of a centuries-long failure of the magisterium to honor the proper limits of its own doctrinal authority," end of quote. Historian Alana Harris, in the title of her 2018 edited volume on Humanae Vitae, speaks of the schism of 68, as Humanae Vitae caused a major rift between large sections of the faithful of the global north and the papacy. Historian Leslie Tendler describes some of the consequences, and I quote, "Large numbers of Catholics do not regard their church's teaching as binding or even necessarily terribly relevant when it comes to non-marital sex, remarriage after divorce, homosexuality, or abortion, which the American bishops have called the most important moral issue facing American Catholics today. What better evidence could there be of a seriously compromised teaching office?" And as Tendler goes on to note, irrelevant institutions, by definition, lack authority. It is interesting to note that not merely theologians and historians commented on the impact of Humanae Vitae. The rift caused by the encyclical was also commented upon by scholars from the social sciences. Famous anthropologist Roy Rappaport remarked on the effect of Humanae Vitae on Catholics in the United States, of how it fundamentally weakened the readiness of Catholics to adhere to official teaching, and I quote, "The Roman Catholic Church suffered immediate and widespread defection, particularly in developed countries. Although most of those who discontinued devotional practices because of disagreement with the encyclical have returned to the Church, many seem to have returned understanding their relationship to the Church differently from before. They are less likely to acquiesce routinely to Vatican dicta on social matters of any sort, and few discuss their violations of birth control rules in the confessional booths. In sum, what appears not only to an outside observer, but to many within the Roman Catholic Church to be over-sanctification of a highly specific set of rules has cost the Church dearly in general authority, as lay folk reject or ignore dicta of a sort that they previously would have been likely to accept. The corrosion of papal authority, moreover, has not been limited to the reactions of the laity. Theologians have not only challenged the particular encyclical in question, but the infallibility of the papal authority upon which its promulgation was based," end of quote. In light of this analysis, as I find, it is instructive to study rabbinic thought on the issue of how to respond to the problem that human cognition of God's will is naturally limited. I want to but briefly refer to 3 sentences derived from halakhic methodology, which in my opinion could stimulate the Catholic debates. We might discuss that later. The 3 principles are, and most of you will know it, the Torah is not in heaven. The Halakha follows the school of Hillel and not the school of Shammai. However, both Beit Hillel's and Beit Shammai's teaching are the words of the living God. I would like to give a brief outline of how these principles can contribute, as I find, to revitalizing the Catholic debates on doctrine and authority. First, let me refer to the insight from the Talmud that the Torah is not in heaven, taken from the narrative of the oven of Akademie, a story on a rabbinic dispute about the right understanding of the Torah. I will skip retelling the story at length, as many of you most certainly know it. It revolves around a rabbinic debate of whether an oven is pure or impure, a debate in which Rabbi Eliezer, as a sage of great standing, tries to convince his fellow disputants by making use of miracles to prove his point. However, the other rabbis shrug off Eliezer's supernatural proof. They finally end Eliezer's repeated insistence with a majority decision overruling his opinion. And they defend their majority vote even against a heavenly voice which tries to correct their ruling. Against this heavenly intervention, the rabbis state that the Torah is not in heaven. Surely, the Torah is given by God, so it is from heaven. However, deriving concrete norms from it to guide human conduct is an obligation handed over by God to humanity. After Sinai, drawing normative consequences from the Torah is no longer God's responsibility, but the duty of humankind. Because God gave the Torah to the people of Israel and endowed them with the ability to observe it, the responsibility for applying the Torah became a human one. So we may expect no heavenly help with discovering God's will. This finding has deep implications for ecclesiastical doctrine. While Jews and Christians believe in God's will for humanity, you might agree that doctrine, as those norms which receive God's will with normative implications for our earthly existence, is not in heaven. It is a human creation. As a human creation, it is based on decision. A belief of what is God's will merely transforms into concrete norms serving a certain community, and this community makes a decision which norms serve best to reify God's will in a specific context. These norms substantiating how to pursue God's will may vary over time and are open to change. Historian Barbara Stolberg-Rillinger rightly remarks, and I quote, "Decisions are by definition contingent, that is, one could always decide otherwise," end of quote. Religious doctrine is therefore not a stable, super-temporal or super-cultural body of norms, as neo-scholastic teaching suggests, but a fluid body of normative approaches of how to reify God's will in a very historical and cultural context. Second, the finding that all doctrine is necessarily based on decision has methodological consequences. I want to connect these consequences with the Talmudic narrative of a conflict between the rabbinic schools of the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, which culminates in two remarkable assertions. After a never-ending dispute between both schools about which school is in the right in its understanding of God's true will, a heavenly voice once again ends the debates by announcing, "The Halacha follows Beit Hillel, but most remarkably, both schools' opinions are the words of the living God." The question that arises from this story is how we can consider plural and even contradictory opinions as corresponding with God's will. The story provides us with two reasons to ponder doctrine in this respect. First, it supports the idea that one approach to grasping God's will may indeed be more right than others. Second, however, and this is a specific twist of the story, it emphasizes that this approach has superior merit precisely because it does not exclude other views. The Halacha follows the house of Hillel. The Talmud provides us with an explanation why this is the case by noting, quote, "Because they were kindly and modest, they studied their own rulings and those of Beit Shammai, and were even so humble as to mention the actions of Beit Shammai before theirs," end of quote. Hence, the priority of Beit Hillel's approach is not based on the greater truth of their particular doctrine. Instead, it is the school's hermeneutics and its method of discovering God's will which is favorable in God's eyes. Philosopher Menachem Fish maintains, the heavenly voice should not be understood as ruling sweepingly in favor of the Hillelite-specific halakhic rulings, but as ruling in favor of their approach to the procedures of halakhic decision-making. The school of Hillel, as the story reveals, has come to understand that it is difficult to grasp God's will under earthly conditions and to transform it into concrete norms. Acknowledging that the halakha is human law, the house of Hillel understands that halakhic rulings are the result of decision-making. As decisions, the rulings are contingent and changeable. However, this does not render the process of decision-making arbitrary. On the contrary, when dealing with a matter which is so hard to grasp that it actually requires deciding, the precise methods of deciding become key. This process requires the utmost care with regard to the matter, but also with regard to individuals engaging in the fragile attempts to understanding God's will. Those fellow human beings engaging in these endeavors deserve attention, even when, and particularly when, we do not agree with them. The Hillelitz method accepts that even a seriously different opinion might have a valid point and might therefore contribute to understanding God's will. The message of the Talmudic story is therefore that it is crucial to take others seriously, particularly those opinions which differ profoundly from ours. When trying to decipher God's will, every piece of epistemic support is helpful, particularly the insights of those who do not share our views. The story of the dispute between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai not only tells us that both positions might be the words of the living God, but assures us that both are the words of the living God. In doing so, the story argues strongly in favor of more pluralism. It suggests that accepting differing views on what God wants from humanity is not the unfortunate result of humans not seeing more clearly, but might in fact truly be an expression of God's will for humanity. There are several conclusions which one can draw for the Catholic struggle with doctrinal authority from studying these three principles which I've just mentioned. I just summarize briefly. Doctrine is not in heaven. It is a human creation which attempts to understand God's will for God's people. Doctrine is therefore based on decision, not an arbitrary or random decision-making, but on attempts to listen to God. However, choosing one good option over other plausible options is a decision, and hence a contingent business. Doctrine is open to history and culture. It may change, and it must change, following changes in time and culture. The best way to deal with our epistemically fragile status of understanding God's will and making it real in time and space is to debating and discussing our different views on what we find as according to God's will. This excludes employing conversation stoppers in doctrinal matters, and it excludes relying on the argument of juridical power merely to end the debates. This excludes suppressing the voices of debaters who have a different understanding of God's will and of what normatively accords with it. The best doctrine is that of Beit Hillel, as the Talmud tells us, employing plural interpretations to examining the truth from different angles. The epistemic power of discovering God's will is the power of many. However, this does not render juridical power useless. I'm not arguing in favor of abandoning juridical authority or juridical structures in church. However, I contend that what we need, or what we should or could understand its function differently. Instead of employing juridical power to decide what is God's will, we may come to find the merit of authority to lie in its function, to organize those processes in which the manifold voices of what is God's will may join forces. Thank you for your kind attention.
Yeah, thank you so much for this marvelous presentation. I just beg your patience because I think we will discuss the two presentations after both have been given, and everybody, we have done this today already and it works out quite nicely. And I just now have the honor to introduce to you Sister Teresa Forcades. Moment. She will hardly be in need of a special introduction tonight, but yet you might want to know about her, who is far from being a nun in the sense of this, that this phoneme has become a signifier for people who declaredly are not attached to any religion soever. To the contrary, Teresa Forcades Vila is a physician, theologian, and Benedictine nun in the mountain monastery of St. Benet de Montserrat in Catalonia, Spain. Master of Divinity with a dissertation on the philosophical underpinnings and the pitfalls of multicultural dialogue, apropos Charles Taylor and Hans-Georg Gadamer. Doctor in Public Health with a dissertation on alternative medicine, and Doctor in Sacred Theology with a study of the notion of person in classical Trinitarian theology and its relationship to the modern notion of freedom as self-determination. Her publications include In English Crimes and Abuses of the Pharmaceutical Companies from 2006, and Faith and Freedom, Polity Press 2016. And there are many, many, many others. And I'm not going to read them all out for you. Just be aware that she, in 2013 and 14, taught at the Theology School of the Humboldt University in Berlin, and in 2019-20 at the Universität Iberoamericana in Mexico. From 2015 to 2018, she was granted a permit to live outside of her monastery, to engage in the politics of her country, Catalonia. And since 2017, Forcades is director of the Journal of Christianism and Critical Thinking, Iglesia Viva. Since 2020, she is also director of the monastic school Syncletica. At present, she lives and teaches at her monastery in Montserrat. Teresa, who has dedicated herself to a life in obedience, as we clarified in preparation of this talk, and who has nevertheless been propagated to be a little bit inclined towards disobedience in the eyes of some. Yes.
I thought it was a friendly presentation.
I hope she will teach us now about personal and political freedom, and I'm really, really curious to know what you will tell us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So, well, thank you for the thank you indeed for the presentation and for the opportunity to speak. Personal freedom and political freedom is the title, and I would like to do that inspired by the figure of Simone Weil, another of these Jewish heritage persons that, in her case, not like Edith Stein, of which we have talked, and converted, she wanted to. But as I think Deborah, who is here, will explain, so I will not go into that. But I wanted to focus on this relationship between politics and religion in Simone Weil in the following sense. 1789, French Revolution, Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Important moment, as we all are aware, not only the rights of the citizen, but they are to speak about the rights of man. Of course, Olivia de Gouges says, what about women? And she ends up without the head, so that would be also a topic on its own. But this daring aspect is that you don't speak for only one group of people, but you intend to speak what later will be known as Universal Declaration of Human Rights. According to this author, Simone Weil, this notion of being a subject of rights that lies at the bottom of all liberal democracies and our current societies, it is flawed. And it is flawed because of rights, you can only be an object, not a subject. That's the first problem. Because rights is something that others have to recognize. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's perfect, and we hope that everybody recognizes each other's rights. So I'm not presenting an author that goes against rights, but she's trying to go at a better foundation for our just, free societies. And hence, she head-on criticizes the fact that rights cannot be such a foundation. Because of that, you cannot, it's problematic to think of us, human beings, that want to be free in societies that do not oppress us as subject of rights. Because if we think about it, we are placing our dignity, our fulfillment, our consistency as subjects, or as subjects, we are placing it in the hands of others in a way that she thinks can be improved. Hence, instead of being subject of rights, which she, as I'm pointing out, considers it would be better to call object, she, of course, gives her alternative, which is to be subject of duties. But I must say immediately, because we are speaking about authority in this conference, is not duties towards the authority, what she is going to put at the basis of this human subject that can be free in a society. It's not duties towards the authority, it's not duties towards the state, it's not duties towards whatever hierarchical power. It is duties towards other human beings. That's why her title is a prelude, an attempt, as Choi was saying. Where are you, Choi? Well, he might not be here. But okay, yes, he was at an attempt this morning. So Simone Weil speaks of an attempt of a universal declaration of the duties. So she's paraphrasing, right, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but she calls it Universal Declaration of the duties of man, we can say the human being, towards other human beings. Simone Weil considers that these rights in general are contingent in the sense that they do vary with the circumstances, that if we talk about fundamental rights, we need to clarify that, but she's moving into these duties in a way that says if a person would be alone in the world, that's one example that she draws upon, if somebody would be thought of as alone in the universe, that alone person would still have duties to herself, but would not have rights, because rights, as I say, are conditional, are, as she says, of this earth. And now comes the maybe problematic, but for this group here, interesting to discuss, notion of Weil, when she says that the flaw or the wrong, what in this French Revolution happened that we still are suffering from, would be to attempt to ground on something contingent, something that wants to be absolute. That's the fundamental human rights, right? You don't want to have fundamental human rights that can be taken away from you. But when the foundation of the fundamental rights is the notion of right itself, then according to Weil, that is a contradiction because it's at a human level that can never be absolute. And she thinks the duties of humankind for other human beings, those have a foundation that it is, she says, in heaven. The foundation of the duty towards the other human being is in heaven. And hence, if it is in heaven, cannot be questioned, but it can be verified in our societies. In that, I think Simone Weil, in a very original and peculiar way, might not be that far away, in one sense, in another, yes, of John Rawls when he talks about this overlapping consensus. The difference would be that for Rawls, the overlapping consensus would ground the society. For Weil, it cannot ground it. But it is essential for what she calls verification. So verification for her is that the most ancient writings that have passed centuries and have been considered as precious by the human cultures, the religions, majority religions, or religions that have been also significant for majority of human beings. And in general, any human being that's not being blinded by passion considers it problematic, to say the least, that if I have the possibility to help another human being, I do not do it. To help it in a very concrete way. In Catalonia, I don't know, in Germany, I was surprised when I was in the States because I'm, as Gesine has said, I'm a medical doctor, and we have something in Spain and Catalonia, and I think in Germany too, called the Good Samaritan principle, right? That means, in general, but for physicians more concretely, if being a physician, I pass by an accident, and I pass, they can denounce me. I can go to jail because of that. You are not allowed to do that. By law, right? I cannot just walk away. Of course, I have my business and I'm going somewhere else, but I am being given by the society a training that might be put me in the position that I might save a life, right? So I cannot pass by an accident. I have to stop and then do whatever I can, right? Well, I was shocked when I trained in the United States and I learned that that's not the case. That in the United States, it's nice if you stop by. So they will not say, oh, you shouldn't, right? But it is not your duty because of this foundation being directly linked to this other notion of freedom or of rights, right? So there is no such a thing, and even it goes to the point that if I have somebody drowning here, not being a doctor, I'm a normal human being, right? But I have somebody drowning is right in English, right? That's water here, and there is, how do you call that? This thing that you can attach yourself on, lifesaver? Okay, so a lifesaver next to you, and you are just watching the drowning thing, right? It's a horrible thing. You see what the point I'm trying to make. This is horrible. Any person would be deeply shaken by that. But in the United States, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't have a clue about that, but if you cannot be punished by that. You're just watching, and you cannot be punished, because punishing you would mean to change the foundation on which our social contract is based upon, which would imply that certain duties can be imposed on you in a way that doesn't fit the way that we, or the United States, talks about it. While in European societies, it might be still remnants of Christianity or who knows what that still are coexisting with this idea of the rights as being the sole foundation of our political freedom, right? So that would be the question that Simone Weil is posing. And then she says that basically there are, of course, the foundation of the duties towards other human beings is the fact that human beings are vulnerable and have needs. And that's the foundation of it. Why do I have duties towards another human being? Is because I am a human being and I understand what human needs are. And those human needs is what impinges this duty on me. Founded in heaven. She is already clear. She's not going to say that I'm going to make you a reasoning and I'm going to found that for you. But she's saying we don't justify it on human grounds, but we verify it in human grounds because of this sensibility that seems to have been there historically in different cultures and in us who are here in the room and in many people. That's why I said it looks a little bit like when John Rawls speaks about this need for thinking about the justice of the society, not knowing if you're going to be rich or poor. Because if you know if you're going to be rich or poor, well, guess what? There is a bias in the way you consider the rules should go. Whether you're going to be healthy or sick, because there will be a bias. So that's why this appeal to the big texts or the sacred texts or the precious texts of society or different cultures, it's important because it removes you a little bit of these immediate passions or biases. So she says human needs, of course, are of bodily type, and hunger is the one she takes as an example for all the others, protection from violence and shelter and warmth, and she says, curiously enough, maybe it's not for everyone, but she says hygiene also. It's one human need, and you can fill that list of bodily human needs. But next to them, then she wants to speak about the soul, the needs of the soul. And she acknowledges that the needs of the soul are a bit more tricky to make a list of. Nevertheless, she's going to offer a list that I want to comment, but the important part of it is that this list, what's the difference? Because if you speak about human needs of the soul, how do you distinguish that from the desire, right? Somebody can have a strong need for another person, but do you have a claim to have this other person next to you? Is the strength of your need or your desire, your need understood as subjective desire, what it's going to be the foundation of this claim? Well, for Simone Weil, the moment of distinction between whim, desire, and need is that needs are by definition limited, while desires are by definition unlimited. So that if I consider freedom as the correspondence between my desire and its fulfillment, this is a doomed project. Because I desire universal justice. I desire that no child goes hungry and no adult either. Is that a bad desire? Should I limit my desire? If my freedom is my personal freedom is my correspondence between the fulfillment and my desire, then it's either I don't desire good things because I don't want to be frustrated in my freedom, or I will never be free, which that is something that we could consider by Bakunin, for example, and the anarchist tradition of which Simone Weil is quite close to, says that I cannot be free unless everyone is free. So there is also many things, good things to learn from this tradition. But Simone Weil goes another route that understands that there is a freedom of choice, and this freedom of choice is the one I will first speak of, and then there is a freedom that it's not only the freedom of choice, but the freedom between my thinking and my doing. That you can call personal coherence. That the free person is the coherent person. We can call it authentic person. And that includes the others in my personal freedom. So that my personal freedom is not what I achieve when I shoot me off everybody else, but when I open up to these duties I have towards others, and then I'm in the position to realize my potential as a human being, so that my personal freedom is not in competition with the other people's personal freedom. That this would be a capitalist, territorial, competitive notion of freedom, which we are familiar with when we say, my freedom finishes where yours starts. And I see the point that why that this is said, right? But if we analyze this, if my freedom stops where yours starts, that is, as I said, a territorial understanding of freedom. And one that freedom cannot be desired at its fullness, because then you would be a psychopath. If you desire, it's like truly in medicine, psychopathy would be defined, or this childish omnipotence, right? I would be the most free when I could determine all conditions around me, right? So that leaves no room for others, as you very nicely pointed at the Halacha, how beautifully they say, okay, there are other voices here. That's a problem. No, it seems for the Halacha it's not a problem, right? They can welcome. But for certain notions of freedom in our free society based on certain notions of freedom, that is a problem. We might not recognize it always, but it is a problem. You cannot aspire to really be free if you define freedom as something that can come into concurrence with others. So Simone Weil acknowledges the freedom of choice can come into concurrence, and I'll say quickly with what she balances that. But she does not stop with the freedom of choice, and she moves into, you might want to call freedom as virtue, but not virtue as something that goes against our fulfillment. By the contrary, right? There is a way of understanding freedom that's deeper. And this is the one that, if you will, in the Gospels, when it says where the Spirit of God is, there is freedom. Right? Okay, what freedom are we talking about? Or when St. Augustine says, love and do whatever you want. Love and do whatever you want. Because only if you love, you will do whatever you want. Because if you don't love, then you fear. And if you fear, you'll be acting under constraints. But that, I'm moving a bit away. So I continue a little with the list of human needs of the soul of Simone Weil, because the first one, it's freedom. And here she wants to restrict herself to freedom of choice because she wants to have a place for that, right? So freedom of choice is a need of the human soul. You cannot be fulfilled as a human being if you cannot exercise your choice. What balances this freedom of choice for Simone Weil? Of course, is not oppression. There is no need for oppression in human soul. But what balances that for her is order. But don't imagine a military order or a monastery order in that sense of people just going in nicely symmetrical like lines. Has nothing to do with that. For Simone Weil, order means that you live in a society that does not require of you, that does not place you unnecessarily, and I'll explain with an example, in an incompatible way of fulfilling two of your duties. I'll give the example and then it's clear. For example, I live in a society, I might be a mother, I'm not in my case, but I have a child, the child is sick, I have a duty to care for that child. I'm the mother, right? It's clear that I have a duty. But I'm a worker too. And can I call sick and say, well, not call sick, I'm not sick, but call and say, my child is sick, so I'm not going to work today, right? For Simone Weil, an unorderly society that attempts against the fulfillment of the person is one that does not contemplate this possibility. That when I call and say, I have my child, they say, okay, do whatever you want, but if you don't come, you're out. This is happening today, right, in our free societies. So that's wrong. This is something fundamentally wrong. And that happens to more and more people, and I'll make some comment at the end about it. So order means order, that the fundamental duties can be fulfilled, and you cannot rule out that at a given moment you have two children, one is here, the other one is there, okay, which one do you attend first? So let's be realistic. There are possibilities where Your duties might conflict with each other, and that's human limitation. So, of course, that is to be acknowledged. But one thing is that objectively given human limitation, and another is a society. We are talking about political freedom too, right? Personal freedom, political freedom. How do we live together? How do we build together a society? Don't we take that into account? If we don't even start with duties of people, then how can we take that into account? That there might conflict. And if they do conflict, there is a responsibility of whoever is organizing the society to minimize that. And it seems our society maximizes that. And we speak about freedom, and then that's a confusion. That's one good example of what the confusion. And we are doing that in ways that are, for example, this very well known today, this precariousness of jobs, right? That many people increasingly don't know their schedule. You are aware of that, right? That you work and they say to you, okay, we'll call you in if we have need of you. And if not, we won't. And so you have to be available. This is horrible for all the other needs. How can you grow as a human being? How can you even be in peace with yourself if you cannot plan ahead? It comes the birthday, again, of your child, but so many other examples, and you then are called in, and what do? Even if you work for the Uber, that supposedly is something free, right? No, if you don't respond, then you're going to be out and taken points and all these horrible things that happen. In that regard, for the working, maybe you all know about it, but I was very impressed by a book from James Bloodworth that the title is Hired. I don't know, anyone is familiar with that? It's in the UK, it was published maybe 2018 or maybe 16, and it is a journalist that went undercover and worked for Amazon, and worked for a call center, and worked for Pflege, for taking care of people in the home, and worked, the fourth one I don't remember, but did that. So it's 6 months undercover in low-wage Britain. And then he explains what's happening now. Well, a few years ago, but it's now. And so it attempts against all this, and it does that under the name of respecting the rights, right? So that's a fundamental problem. Now, having said what is this order, and at what time am I done?
I think you have some minutes.
Okay, but until, okay. 10 minutes I have, or
no,
not yet?
Minutes.
Okay. Okay, but no, it doesn't matter, because in the discussion we can go deeper, and I'm making some of the points, that's enough because we are open. So maybe in 5 I'll try. Okay, so a bit quickly I say some of the other needs, the list, and it would be, second need for Simone Weil would be obedience. You feel, oh, is that a need of the human soul? Well, yes. Simone Weil considers that if you are not accountable to anyone, you are a sick person. And if you are not sick, you will be sick soon. So the sovereign, it's a monstrosity. The sovereign understood as, I'm not accountable to anyone. This is unhuman. That cannot be allowed. So accountability, obedience is accountability, that you have to respond to others, right? That's a human need, a need of the human soul. But it needs to be balanced, because as I said, each one of the human needs, because they are the needs and not desires, have a balancing one. So which is the one balancing obedience? It is responsibility. So she thinks that every human being needs to be made responsible by the community. And I love this, because that's what I experienced at the monastery. It's like, even you can be a sister with many possibilities or trainings, you can be sisters that have none, but you are given a responsibility. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. But that's your responsibility in the community. That does marvels for a human being, as you all know, and in a family with the children and the teenagers. Sometimes I want to take the responsibility, but this is a human thing to recognize that need, and then it means there is a right to be called into accountability. You see how it changes a little bit the view. Because if we acknowledge that there is a need for obedience, then your right is that you are being called into accountability. And this is what any student likes. Well, I'm not sure about any student, but you like the professors to just check on you, right? You feel that then you are growing. Otherwise, you are left alone. Oh, how nice. Maybe, in some cases. But I think you get the point, what I'm trying to say with this example. And the same thing with the responsibility. You have a right to be given a responsibility. See the thing? So this would link beautifully with Pope Francis, this idea of descartados, no? That's discarded ones. Yesterday, Jose spoke about that. 1/3, you said you are even more optimistic than I am, right? I unfortunately think it's even more than that. Of today's humanity, it's not needed. The system does not need all these people. The whole African continent, we love it because of the prime matters, right? The minerals and the biology. But the people, they could all go according to this way of thinking, right? So this is horrible because there is a need, and besides there is a right to be needed. Because it's, again, grounded in heaven, right? You are not going to ground it in human reason, but you are going to verify it by human experience. Your experience, your family, your monastery, your whatever. So this is another one. Another one would be for Simone Weil, the need for hierarchy. You think, what? A need for hierarchy? I mean, Judith is going to say, wow, no. No. How does she explain that? Because hierarchy, what is hierarchy? It's like sacred power, right? So do we need that, this sacred power? According to Simone Weil, because these needs are grounded in heaven, right? It is good for the human soul, she considers that a need, that there is a representation of that. And then she speaks about the British monarchy as an example, right? But then it's key that this monarch is symbolic, right? It has no power whatsoever, because that's the point, right? But it's important. It's not, or maybe I'm not sure about the presidency in Germany, because we only have prime minister now in Spain, right? But here you have a presidency. Why do you want that? Well, to represent as a symbolic, right? And this one doesn't get elected so often, even if it gets elected, but it's this, because otherwise it's this sacredness or this attribution that's a bit beyond human gets attributed to other figures, and that's even more dangerous if it's not recognized, right? So hierarchy, the most important thing is it has no power, real power, that's very important, and then it is not the one who has the need has to acknowledge that the hierarchy is not upon the person, it's not because that person is wonderful that I can attribute hierarchy to the person. It has nothing to do with the personal talents of the person. It has to do with this human need, and then it just represents. For example, there is some tribe in the Polynesia that they elect a king of the tribe, and then they have a throne, right? And then they place the king on the throne, and he cannot move for the whole year or something like this. And then they go about their business. But every time they pass in front, they go like this, and then they go about their business. So it's interesting how they might have recognized this. So I won't go to all the needs, but okay, only enumeration. Another one is hierarchy. What balances hierarchy is equality, because that would be monstrous again, right? If you think somebody has the hierarchical power because of God has touched that person and made it special. No, that would say no. That person is like us, but it is now representing this other level, let's call it. There is private property, according to Simone Weil, is a need of the soul, but collective property as well. And private property, it's not endless, so it is limited. You need private property, not because you have a paper that says you are the one who owns this, but because you have a need to private property, a need of a house, a need of your clothing, that another person cannot come and say, today you dress blue, right? And you have a need to your transportation, your bicycle or your horse or your car, and a need also to be participating in the ownership of the means of your labor. And then risk, security, it's a human need, but risk is a human need. So this would also speak volumes for today, but I'm closing now because I want to close with a quote that would also, I think, help us see how we can think differently about what it is that we need in order to live together in a meaningful way, in a free way. And that's a quote, and we can discuss it if you like after. A happy young woman, pregnant for the first time, is sewing a piece of cloth and concentrates on sewing it properly. While doing it, this pregnant woman does not forget for a moment the child she's carrying inside her, because she's sewing for the child, right? Is preparing. At the same hour, somewhere in a prison workshop, a woman convict is also sewing. The woman convict is concentrating on sewing properly because she's afraid of being punished. One could imagine that the two women are doing the same work at the same time, and that their attention is occupied by the same technical difficulty. There is nevertheless an abyss of difference between the one and the other work. The whole social problem consists in making the workers pass from the second to the first of these two situations. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And before I can even think about posing a first question, I already see a hand rise. Jose Casanova, please.
No, please.
No, please. I catch up when my time has come.
Thank you, both of you, for these wonderful and challenging presentations. I mean, one thing which obviously they had in common was this critique of the juridification of moral decisions. And I'm going to concentrate on this, I think, which is crucial for us Catholics to understand what is going on. And it is the paradox of the story you've told that we have the juridification of moral decisions to the point where we can talk of new moral confessionalism, at the same time as the Catholic Church is abandoning doctrinal confessionalism. Namely, the Vatican II was the first council in which there was no decision on truth and error. There was no definition of truth and error. Every other council had been a definition of truth and error, orthodoxy and heterodoxy. For the first time, there is an abandonment of this. This is not a function, and actually is to discern the sign of the times, to accept the historicity of precisely of revelation. At the very same moment, when the whole church is doing that doctrinally, we have, for the first time, the juridification precisely of moral issues, but very specific moral issues, all having to do with gender and pelvic issues. And so it is in this respect a really tragic development that we could have such a positive development in one direction, which opens up, of course, the possibility then to enter into religious dialogue with every other culture and every other secular and religious, precisely because this is what the Council is, not anymore a definition of what the Catholic faith and the non-Catholic faith or error is, but an opening to the whole world. And then we close ourselves with what defines us as Catholics is precisely those decisions which are purely juridical, and of course nobody takes seriously. So it's actually an intellectual tragedy for the Church.
Do you want to answer directly?
Well, I would like to ask you back, how do you explain that? I mean, it's fascinating. You have this pastoral council, which really, as you said, refrains from being a juridical council. And then you have this backlash in the 60s, shortly after. The people were shocked. So is it a counter reaction? Is it a new interpretation of a reinterpretation of the council in terms of the old juridical pattern?
I mean, if you look at the three last documents, obviously the three key documents, right? Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral of the church in the modern world. Dignitatis Humanae, which for the first time opens up religious freedom, right? And third, Nostra Aetate, which defines it as an age of religious pluralism, right? And yet, on the other side, you confessionalize moral issues which are not really serious, certainly not gospel moral issues.
But we know the reason, right?
Right, of course, but the question is, for me, sociologically, the question is, we are today, the whole world is fighting culture wars around these issues, not religious wars. We don't have religious wars anymore. We have culture wars everywhere, globally, precisely on those, because it is the greatest revolution, moral revolution in the history of humanity, and the transformation precisely on gender morality. And there is a backlash, yes.
And also I wanted to add, right, that the intrinsic maybe challenge of that, but the Curia, right? So that's very clearly that at that moment the Curia had prepared all the documents differently, right? And it was, I won't say by chance, but almost, right? I mean, I think the Holy Spirit, if I say the Holy Spirit, then what it means. Now it's on vacation, so I won't say that, because otherwise, but it was really very narrow. Then the voting was very high, right, which was surprising, but it was very narrow. And after that, we had that Pope that died, right? After, well, I don't know. And then we had what Pope Francis now experiences, which is really a difficulty of enacting through reform in a lasting way. A document, you can just say it, okay, it's there. But now you change the law and you change the everyday working of the church. And now this last document, right, that the Pope has, the reform of the Curia, Predicate Evangelium. What I like the most is not only that women, all the baptized, can now be at the highest level, let's call it minister, right, of the functioning of the church. But the best is that the mandates are 5 years. So in 5 years, they are all home. All this. No, that's the point. I mean, that's what he's trying to do. In 5 years, all the all the people that now are the head of this, the head of that, that before we thought ecclesiastical career, it's like you get in Rome and now that's it for life, right? Nobody takes you out. It's gone. It can be prolonged 5 more years, so it could be, but then it's decision of somebody else, right? The Pope or another body, but not your right, to stay there. So let's see how it's implemented, because many things have happened before. But this, I think it's the hope. It's not only because now theoretically it's open to anyone, but because there is a limit to how many years. It changes the whole notion. You don't go to Rome to just be honored and be there for all your life. You go to Rome, you'll have to go back home. To do what? Parish priest? How is that? I mean, that's scary, right? No, it changes the whole thing. Let's see how it works, right? But it changes the whole thing. And now, okay.
Did I? Okay, Menachem, yes, please.
Give me a second. Please. Thank you both for this this wonderful talk. 2 points. First, I think the tragedy of the tradition of Halacha is that the Mishnah is formed by the students of Bet Hillel, but the structure was taken over by people of the piety of Bet Shammai. And being a product of the Rabbinic Bet Midrash, I can tell you that this is a painful point for people who come from Bet Hillel. And their whole, I consider myself one of them, and looking from a Jewish point of view, Jesus of Nazareth is the left wing of Bet Hillel. So we're constantly negotiating this line within our tradition, and we don't always fare well. So this is, I think, one point that's also worthwhile taking into consideration, and think about the imagery of the story of the oven of Achnai, is that the Bet Midrash it's the leaning tower of Yavne, because both these forces are dominant forces in it. It's not the story of the oven of Achnai is not about the victory of Bet Hillel. It's about a very complex structure that we live in, and this moves me to the second point, to Sister Teresa, about I think that the history of modern polities is that the more they aspire to ethical perfection, the more despotic they are. And I would begin a reflection on what would be a moral stature of a citizen in a modern republic, from, again, appreciating that tragedy, that we want a lot, and any tool we have is only as good as the people who are using it. That leads me personally to actually prefer looking at polities from the point of view of production and labor, and ask what would be the moral counterpoint to it. But I wouldn't want to put my morality of the people who run our polities. I'd like to be pleasantly surprised. But all too often, other things happen. So, I've said enough. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think what you rightly raised, and that's one thing I was pondering, is that I kind of easily went over the ambivalence of the text. I mean, if you mentioned Agna, the story doesn't end there. And I think one probably has to discuss the ending as well, which kind of gives the whole story another ambivalence. Because it's not a happy ending and everybody is happy and the thing is decided. But then there comes excommunication and a lot of bad things happen. So we're kind of left clueless what really is the solution. So I think what I did, maybe that's my Catholic desire to find some clarity, is to present it with less ambiguity than one could or should. But you also mentioned tragedy. You said the tragedy of the story is this. And I think why I did it the way I did it, or I kind of grasped the story and tried to confront Catholic doctrine and authority with this story, is it gives us resources to see that there's a tragedy in trying to find too much clarity, or to be too precise and to define and decide everything by authority. And although the stories are not clear, and they don't have a happy ending, and they're ambivalent throughout and through history until our point here in their results, they confront Catholicism with the fact that life is ambivalent and that we don't have clear answers. And that maybe the only approach is the Hillelitz approach to keep discussing and taking others serious and listening to the opinions of others and not excluding positions or people from the debate. And that is what's happening in Catholicism in parts of you mentioned the issues, where it's just, we do not talk about women's ordination anymore. Or we do not talk with people who talk about women's ordination anymore. Why? So this kind of absurdity.
There's a one-page document by John Paul II, and it ends one single page, no theological justification, and it ends, this issue is solved and resolved forever.
Forever.
And we reopen it.
And that's a conversation stopper. And I think what we can learn, and why I like to draw to the stories, maybe too simplistically, I admit, is that it kind of confronts us with this wisdom. You cannot employ conversation stoppers. You might not find the solution in the end, yes, and maybe you'll be all unhappy and we'll be fighting till the end of the day, but conversation stoppers do not work.
But there is consolation in the fact that it's the first time in our tradition that God laughs.
God laughs.
Probably the last time also.
But that's also a point. God laughs, and he's laughing because he's learning, because says, my children kind of tricked me. And that is something from a Catholic point of view, which is also very difficult to admit. Do we accept a God that may learn and become wiser and say, okay, I just learned something about human beings, what they're capable of? So that's also something which I'd like to draw on, because this is something which we have lost in our tradition, to accept God is always Deus absconditus, he's perfect and he knows everything, he doesn't learn and he doesn't change, he doesn't repent and all that. And I think the Jewish tradition also, with the repenting God, being sorry about things that he did, is something that we kind of lost on our way. So this is why I'm so kind of desperately clinging to these stories.
Only that, for example, in Feminist Catholic Theology, Elizabeth Schüttler-Fiorenze, her book on But She Said, right? Feminist Hermeneutics, the title is But She Said, because the encounter of Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, she teaches something to Jesus, right? So she's actually in the place of the Father, if you want to think about the Trinity, because Jesus thinks his mission is only for the people of Israel, and then this woman says, but also the dogs take the crumbles that come from the table of the children, and he's shocked. And Jesus says, in Matthew and Mark, right? So it says, in one, your faith has saved you, and in the other, your word has saved you. And the word is telling that woman, your word has saved your daughter. Not I am the word, the logos, and I'm saving your daughter. It's your word is saving your daughter, right? So I think you're right in the sense that normally it's not like the majority, but we have some in that also.
And would you also answer to Menachem?
Surely, that I think, Menachem, that when you or anyone says, let's better not to put the morality in the hands of the rulers, right? Well, I don't think anyone can disagree with that, right? But wouldn't that be, and I'm exploring with you now, right? But wouldn't that be the case that if we take seriously our living together, right? We do, partially, and maybe it's good to put it as little as possible, but can we not do it? Because, and then if we do, and the examples I gave is horrible, and it's normalized, we cannot go on like that. I don't know whether Simone Weil can inspire us for something better, but certainly at least inspires me for bringing into consciousness to say, wait a minute, it cannot be that private property, and that was, as you might well know, right, a big discussion in this French Revolution, whether next to the right to life, are we going to write the right to private property? And at the beginning it was, no, of course, that's another level, it's something different, right? But at the end it was written, we are stuck. You need to redistribute. So you give me a solution for that. I think here we can get an inspiration for that. But unless we redistribute in radical ways, the wealth, right? I don't see a possibility for human societies to be anything close to just or free. And you have to challenge this right of private property, and you can challenge that probably in other grounds. Roosevelt just taxed the American people with 95%, I think, in 1934 or 35, after the big depression. So it's been done before within capitalism, but I don't see our time and age like going in that direction. And yes, that's...
Okay, no, sure.
I wanted to thank you, Sister Teresa, for this very deep insight into Simone Weil with respect to the very rich references to the Jewish dimension of her writing. And I mean, I always knew it, but you have added a precision to it that I found really amazing. And I understood when I listened to your distinction between the objective dimension of the law and the subjective dimension of the duties. And there's two detours I hear now. I didn't know before. You have taught us now. One through the Maimonidean teachings and one through the Brisker rabbinic tradition. Because when you speak about the objective dimension of the law, I'm an object of the law. That is, of course, what we connect to Halacha. Mm-hmm. And the duties, the subjective dimension, that I actually have duties towards others, these are mitzvot. I don't know the distinction between mitzvot and halacha. You made it very, very clear in the work of Simone Weil. I found that so interesting. And also to talk about duties, like mitzvot, ben adam la'atzmo, like between a person and herself. It's really a direct reference to the whole body of the discussion of the classical scholastic literature on halacha and mitzvot in the, 12th, 13th century. So I didn't know how precise these references are within Simone Weil.
And she would be surprised as well.
It's really,
because I don't think she draws in any moment that explicitly.
And that's even more interesting because there are these correlations that are also simultaneous in time, that are not like influences. We're not talking about vertical, linear time. It's a kind of simultaneity of a way of thinking, right? And you have also distinction that, as I remember, there are people more learned than I, right? But in the Brisker rabbinic tradition, there's a distinction between the chefta and the gavra, sort of, is something that's related to the subjective, obligation, to me, or is it related to as an object of my responsibility, as you said. So this is also a very, very prominent conceptual distinction in the 18th, 19th century. So I think it's very interesting. I mean, you taught me, because I did several things maybe with Simone Weil in the artistic or the kind of the mystical, more mystical, but also that the subjective obligation that as duties or the mitzvot need a detour via nothingness, so to speak, like via the heavenly book or script, is very interesting. I agree with Menachem Loberbaum that God forbid that the halacha or the law should not be in any way connected to a subjective position. It must be sort of the object of my obligation. And this is the critique maybe of the European modern like a universal morality that sort of thinks that morality has to do with law. Mm-hmm. But you made very clear that it has to do with duties. Mm-hmm. And it's a very old, like, rabbinic distinction that I just learned it now. I mean, it was like, it's very clear. And it's, of course, not an influence. It's not a linear thing. It's not citing something. It's a simultaneity in a way of thinking. Mm-hmm. It's really beautiful. Thank you.
And thank you for that. And just another brief example of what kind of changes or what kind of implications would have to think differently. Of the pairs of needs of the soul I didn't mention is the one that says a need of the soul is punishment. You feel like, what are you talking about, right? But I now, because of a project I'm involved with about the theology from the existential peripheries, I'm a bit closer to people who are in prison. So this sense of I just paid what I did, it's an unburdening of, right, of a very deep way that only the one who has experienced it. Otherwise, it's like, well, you did that and we forgave you, but there is, that needs to be explained better, but there is a point here, but what I wanted to emphasize is the other one, which is not reward. It's not like punishment and reward, the two needs. No, there is no need for reward, but there is a need for honor. That's what Simone Weil says, and makes it concrete. How? She says, how come that the big soldiers are recognized in our society and have like statues? How come that the big scientists, and what is the mothers that work at home? How are they recognized in our society? Okay, very beautiful, Simone Weil. And where are the workers in the farms, right? Where maybe the Soviet Union did the worker, but it's another thing, right? But not only in a statue, but do we honor in a deep way certain people? Yes, and others not at all. She even draws a possibility for a sabbatical for the workers, the manual workers, that after a few years, they are entitled to a sabbatical. And then they go to other factories and they visit other workers, and then they go for a year and they learn from others, and then they come back. So you look at this and think, what is she talking about? We are used to people at the university to have sabbaticals and to have these opportunities. And then suddenly she starts to opening up, and you really see that we could be organized socially in ways that would respect these needs of the human soul for everyone, right? And we are stuck with the freedom and say, you do whatever you want with your freedom, and we know the problems of that, right? The falsity of that, not the problems, the falsity. Because so much of our needs are relational, so we cannot fulfill them alone.
I have a question as somebody who is outside of, I'm a Protestant, so my interest in canon law is from a distance. I really like the idea that dialectic and dispute should become integral to canon law. I think that's a tremendously valuable way to move away from an over-juridical perspective. And I think that stands some chance of opening up debate over issues that I, as a left-wing Protestant, care about. Reproductive rights, sexual freedom, the ordination of women. So if I could have you two lecturers leading the path to Vatican III, I would be delighted. That's a future for canon law that I would feel very happy about.
It will not be Vatican III, it will be Amazonian I.
I would like that even more. The question I think I have is to do with the value of dispute, conversation, deliberation in face of the climate crisis and the ecological devastation. If there is one time in which I would like the Roman Catholic Church to be juridical, it would be in informing human beings how best to halt the climate crisis by corporate entities, multinational corporations, acting differently. Now, there are those suggestions in Laudato Si, right? It's a remarkable document. I might fault it a little bit for the anthropocentrism, which I see persisting there. But do we need deliberation and debate about the ecological crisis, or will that just be an excuse to defer action until it's too late?
Thank you. And I think because of the time, we take another question. Yes.
Quick points. If you as a Catholic are looking for moral clarity and closure, as you know, the Talmud is a very poor choice of text. But there are two methodological bottom lines. One is that life is a laboratory. And not only you, but a lot of other people are doing their best to develop a moral way of living, which means what you end up with is contingency, change, multiplicity, ambiguity. And is this not better than moral certitude, given the absolutism that usually follows? That's the first. And the second is that the Bible is a problem set, not an instruction manual to copy. It's narrative, law, ritual, description, history, botched history, made-up history, about almost everything in human life for us to work through. And sometimes you have to work through many, many chapters to get to the end of the problem set by which one can work through to a moral position. And I think these two methodological points might be something to consider in the Catholic landscape.
One. Yes. How about it? Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for these really inspiring talks. From a lawyer's perspective, my question would be, is not one of the main problems that we had in the post-Vatican II era a lack of juridical form in Catholicism? Because juridical form also allows for reflection upon what authority is, and if authority could be also a means to discover, as you described it, Judith, in your talk. And, well, with all due respect to your enthusiasm for Predicate Evangelium, I don't see clearly what exactly power is in that document and what authority is. And I see that also if we look into what's happening on the diocesan level in Germany, for example, because we see that there's a tendency towards power sharing. Women are participating in executive positions, but of course they're not participating in any kind of spiritual power. And I think that's a very, very dangerous dynamics. And I'm not sure whether without a lack of more juridical formation, and I think there's also clearly a difficult legacy with having had a number of popes now who are not really into legal thinking whatsoever. I think we would need some more kind of reflection about what exactly is authority and what exactly power is, and that I've found also kind of lacking a little bit in both your talks, and maybe you could have a few words on this as well.
So, no, I think you should be entitled to answer. The two of you, who wants to begin? Please.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I try to kind of at the end try to make clear that I'm not arguing against juridical power or clarifying what we mean when we talk about juridical power. What I would think is employing it in a different way. I think the problem that I wanted to highlight is what we can witness, I think, since the 19th century is a shift from taking issues that are rather epistemic problems of truth-finding, what do we believe, what is our common faith, and so on, and reformulating this in juridical terms. I'm not saying this is a juridical, but it takes on a form of quasi-juridical decision where you wouldn't actually expect a decision, but maybe something like a dissent, a talk about, a dispute about what do we really all share in our faith. This would be, I think, a matter where dispute, discussion, collective truth-finding would be adequate. And that there it does not happen. And in other contexts, where you rightly demand, here we have a need for juridical form, for juridical deciding, for a clear outing of what is a juridical decision and so on, then it does not appear. And I fully agree with your analysis on Predicate Evangelium. I'm not too optimistic about that document too, because it's actually kind of a cover-up. You leave the law as it is. Women cannot do anything. There's no power of governance for lay people. We just leave it and we give them a little something and it feels good. And that's actually not a juridical way of approaching the problem. So for me, it's kind of a cover-up. And I think we can witness in several of the documents that you leave the structure as it is and add some bits and pieces that make some feel-good atmosphere in some, but it's not really a juridically liable way of treating the issue. I'm not sure if I
when
made
you say
myself clear,
that about not having power of governance, you mean that being prefect of a dicasterium wouldn't do it?
The thing is, then
Because
people ask, how is it possible that women can be prefects now? We don't get an answer. How is it possible juridically? We don't know.
Okay, because it needs to be implemented, which is key, of course. But it's if you are a prefect, you have power within the Catholic Church.
I'd say you obviously have power. What?
You have authority?
Well, you do. I mean, at least Alessandra Smerilli is now the Secretary General, right? Well, some things are happening in that dicasterium that otherwise would not.
Well, I wouldn't disagree that these people obviously have
No, they do.
sociologically power and
And
authority.
it's one. So-
In a Weberian sense.
And Natalie Beckert with the Synod, she is doing things.
But the law is
Of course, we
careful
need
to avoid
much
that.
more. But
Sorry.
I allow for two other
I-
questions, and then you get the opportunity to answer again, and then we round it up and transfer the whole thing to the.
My question is for Professor Hahn, and I appreciate and have been in other conversations where people have reached to Halacha for the kind of stimulation I think you're looking for. I don't think you believe the answer's there, and you said as much, but it is just stimulating other possibilities. And I wanted to ask you, I'm sure you know of this, I'm wondering, it seems to me a closer reach would be English common law for what you're looking for.
Yes.
instead of civil code law. The problem you have is a civil code where for those who don't know, the judge enunciates the answer as opposed to having a fact situation before her that allows her almost the narrative reach that you describe in the Halacha, right? Because it's a story. But it still allows you what the law always needs, which is a decision, which academics seldom realize, right? We are able to push off decisions, but the law must make a decision. What you've got is a bunch of academics acting as judges, it seems to me, and that it would be, again, an easier reach to go for the British common law and include such principles as restraint, right? Which is a principle where courts can choose not to decide. They can wait until a question is ripe. So notions of ripeness, restraint, and then requiring a fact situation and an appellate system that would put it through the whole system and everybody'd have a chance to talk. Now, I'm not saying this is perfect. Obviously, the United States has a terrific problem right now. but the system is quite different, these two, civil and common law. And I just wanted to hear you respond to that. I'm sure you know that's out there, and I'm wondering why you didn't reach for an easier option.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'll just be very, very brief. One comment regarding the Talmudic Dispute, which I think an important principle that really sets it apart and gives it both its weakness and its power, is that it's not for the sake of anything other than the divine, right? It's L'Shem Shamayim, for the sake of heaven, and importantly, that the parties are disinterested by definition. So there is no concept, there is no authority, there's no element of power or authority or even a goal, because the parties are disinterested, and that's why, and the fact that there is a certain decision then, according to the majority, is almost arbitrary, right? So that was just one short comment, and but to Simone Weil, which was extremely inspiring and just really moving to me, and does resonate with, I think, with current global conversations that are going on in the margins of philosophy and, or outside of the academic dispute. One comment and one question. the comment is that I was thinking the whole time about the Maimonidean and other notion of imitatio Dei, right? Of the morality of the consciousness of being created in the image of God as both a way of being, imitating the loving kindness, the chesed of God, and as the fulfillment of being created in the image of God. And that is by exercising the loving kindness of God towards other people, other human beings, and all human beings, not only Jews. And the other one is the question, really. I mean, would you say that Simone Weil and maybe others also today who are sort of thinking in those terms of infinite resources, infinite power, power with rather than power over, and so on, would that be a basis for maybe an ethics of empathy as a counter-political paradigm?
So I think Judith should have the opportunity to first answer. Sometimes it is not so practical to have some questions together, but
no.
The last one was so directly to you that you should.
I think it's quite evident that common law is the dialogue partner in much what I do, because it's you can. In my studies, I really managed to understand the weaknesses of canon law first in comparison to the common law approach, really, and to understand what it means that the canon law as we have it now, and not in the past, interestingly. I mean, we have this kind of common law tradition in the medieval times, and then the codified tradition started in 1917, and with all the problems that came with that, was something that I really started to understand when I started to study common law, and not before. So it's an evident dialogue partner for my work. Why I still sometimes go to the rabbinic tradition is because what common law does not deal with is the common problem that rabbinic Judaism and Catholicism has, divine law. In dealing with norms that, in a very different way, but are norms which express whatever that means, God's will. What do we do with that? And this is something that I cannot tackle with common law, but where the rabbinic approach kind of hands me instrument or thoughts or just inspiration, as you said, to deal with this question: what do we do with the idea that there's God's will out there and we are somehow bound to grasp it? And this is something where the rabbinic tradition is helpful for me to find ways of, plural ways of approaching, dialectical ways of approaching this will, and not juridical approaches to defining what it is, where I find the rabbinic sources very inspiring. But yes, on a sociological level, I'd always turn to common law to compare that here.
So there are a couple of things I want to make reference to. And the first was, on speaking of Laudato Si, that still has some shortcomings. The document that, to my understanding, goes deeper in that direction is the one after the Synod on the Amazonia. That one has aspects that Laudato Si does not contemplate, and it has, on the grounds of challenging capitalism, is the strongest document, no doubt about it. And I was astonished when I read it, right? Another thing is, what are we going to do with that? So I'm fully, right, I agree, and I thank you for the caution, right? Because, but the fact that it's written down, I celebrate fully, right? And so on authority and power, it's a whole, right, discussion. And I agree with you when you have said that the Vatican II did not take juridical form, and that it's true, you can read the document and interpret in one way or interpret in another, right, in many instances. So that would have been helpful to secure certain advances. I think it's true. And power and authority, you this time aware of the distinction that could be power is this capacity to force onto others, and authority could be the one that you gather consent, right, that's freely given to you because you have authority, like Jesus had an authority that came from within. But I do think, and here I'm a bit Marxist, and we went to the museum this afternoon, that if you are given power over a big budget, then your authority will follow also in many instances. And that's what I'm seeing in these women that never before had that, and now they do have. They dispose, truly. And there are very few, and of course this is insufficient, and no question about this, right? But okay, I do celebrate that we have, because it's real. It's not only, that would be maybe the point, right? It's not future only, right? What it is insufficient, that's very clearly, but it is real. And that, I think, it's good to acknowledge, at least. And then on this point on the image of God and this ethics of empathy, right? Well, I would need to think about it and put it right more, talk more with you about what exactly can we understand under that. The empathy, for sure. The ethics, it's not that I don't like ethics, but it's that what I try to make the point, and maybe that is a bit related, I'm not sure, Judith, to what you were saying about this divine law, right? Is that this author, Simone Weil, is appealing to this heaven domain, but not for a faith group. That's the point, right? She's claiming, and maybe we agree, maybe not, she's claiming that there is enough verification in humanity through important texts of the past. She quotes the Egyptians that she loves so much and says that at the end of my life I cannot be told that I have made anybody cry in a way. Okay, they are inspiring texts, but they come from very different cultures. And the Chinese and the Japanese, and when you go into these cultures, there were human beings that, in principle, unbeknownst to each other, they have distilled what it seemed to be the best version of human being, right? That's what she claims as verification, and she doesn't claim that is in heaven. Verification is here, right? But it's verifying something that, not she personally, not her religious group, but she thinks we as human beings can claim. It makes sense to us, and if we need to modify, we modify, and the rules as ours are not from heaven. They don't descend, and the ruler is not the one that has to tell us, but she opens up this possibility, maybe, to acknowledge that there is a beyond, right? Even some very clearly understood as atheist, right, people, then some speak about some kind of beauty and some kind of, so this beyond, or this leaving it open, right, or agnosticism would not be competing with that, because they could very well say, okay, as long as you don't make me belong to your group, I'm fine, right, because the violence comes when you try to ground this living together, this society, in something that really cannot be shared. But Simone Weil is claiming that this can be shared, which we need to see, right? But that's her claim, because it does not mean you have to call God any given name, or you can even talk about God, but just you acknowledge that it's not within. What grounds is not within, and that's why I said before, this critique of Barth, right? It might have something to do with this, or Kant with this transcendent and immanent, right? So there is, you acknowledge that there is something in the human being that points to a beyond. And then what do? You're going to make it present here in an absolute way. No, you are making the basic mistake of idolatry, right? No, it's not present in a full way. So then it's not present. No, either. It is present, but it's similar maybe to what you were saying, right? It's present in a tentative way, in a way that we are verifying, right? That needs verification here on earth. So, short answer, yes, probably.
Okay, thank you, the two of you and all of the participants, very much. And I also wish to thank those who looked at us in the screen, say goodbye to them. We just finish our session here, our official part of the session, and out there we have some drinks, don't we have? I think we have, yes. So
for our human needs.
For the human needs, yes. And I hope to be able to ask some questions and to get some more answers outdoors. Thank you so much. Very, very, very.